And you're very welcome along to another episode of the CESI Staffroom. And the CESI Staffroom aims to be a half an hour or so program talking to teachers about what they're doing in their school, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. We want to hear from you. The CESI Staffroom gets most of its information or most of its feedback, or the feedback to us, from the CESI list. The CESI list lives on www.cesi.ie. If you're a teacher and you're not part of the CESI list, what are you doing? Go over to the CESI website, register, and if you have any questions about anything you're doing in your school, it doesn't have to be about technology, just about general teaching and learning. The CESI list is the place to be, where you have, I think last count was about 2,500, give or take, teachers on there. And if you have an idea, the list will let you know whether it's good, and indeed they'll let you know if it's bad as well. So don't be afraid to give us your ideas. Today we're going to continue on from where we left off last week, where we were talking to Kira Negrishkal about G Suite and how she uses G Suite in school. Today we're joined by Conor Power. Conor Power, will you introduce yourself and the school you're from, please?
Yeah, my name is Conor. I'm teaching at Coláiste Ciarán. We're a second level school in County Limerick. Exciting times for us at the moment. We're moving into a new build. It was due to be September, but that's going to be delayed a wee bit. But yeah, I've been teaching there for over a decade now and using G Suite or Google Apps as it was back then for over a decade also. So it's been an interesting evolution for me. I'm also involved with CESI and for many years have been attending the CESI conferences and using the list as an invaluable resource. I do a bit of work for JCT as well on the short course in coding. And we've been doing the Leaving Cert Computer Science as well. So we have a nice spread of activity from the various kind of organizations, and it's nice to link in. And CESI has always been kind of the main fulcrum for that. So that's that.
And with regards to G Suite, how do you find, like, I'd love to talk to you about how G Suite has evolved from when you started using it to what it is now, when it was Google Apps for Education to now. But we can't really go into how it's evolved if I always open up with, what does G Suite look like for you? So last week I asked Kira, if I'm a new teacher and I'm coming to your school, what does G Suite look like for me?
Well, we have we've been using G Suite for quite some time. So, like, as a new teacher in the school, you can't help but be plugged in the minute you arrive. And say we would have had for a long time have provisioned all the teachers and staff with accounts. So it's really like it's the only show in town. And I'm sure others have spoken to you as well about kind of using it for like teacher feedback, forms, surveys, communication in terms of email, and now Meet as well, which wasn't a big part of the equation previously. Obviously, in the times we're in now, it's become hugely important. But what it looks like, is it looks like the one-stop shop for all our communication, and it's very powerful in that regard. So as a teacher coming in, you get your log on, and it can be a bit kind of overwhelming if you haven't. But I think, over the last couple of years, I would speak to teachers in various scenarios, and there are schools that have more or less in terms of reliance on IT over the years. But I think what's happened lately is now it's kind of, all schools are now almost in the same boat. So, I mean, the good thing about G Suite as well is that a huge amount of teachers coming in, if they hadn't used it in an educational setting, would have used it in a personal level, because Gmail, has become so popular. So, it's I mean, and the big thing really about it is, say, I have had experience over the years of numerous VLEs, platforms, you name it. I've either administered it or used it. And what really sells me on the Google stuff, and I'd be known as a good advocate for it, is the it's the minimalist interface and ease of use. It's not always the most fully featured solution out there, but they cut down the kind of interface so that everything you need is at hand and everything makes sense. And you don't always get all the bells and whistles, but that's what makes it an interesting kind of prospect for any teacher coming in. And I think that's where a lot of products in the past didn't gain traction, or we've all known certain VLEs and that you might have got a hardcore kind of maybe 10% of staff buy into it and throw all their stuff up on there and try and get traction with the students, and then there's training days and days and days of training. But I find with G Suite, you don't need a lot of training as an entry point. Now, there are a lot of kind of advanced and extended features that not every teacher would be using that have massive potential, that would require a bit more in terms of training and exemplars of practice. But I think really what's great about G Suite is at a basic level, to do the basics on it, you can get someone, and we have we'd have experience, the team at the school that are all involved, of getting teachers from zero to kind of functional in half an hour. And for teachers that are already using G Suite as a means of communication, like something like Classroom, I would have had teachers saying, oh yeah, I must look at this, and I must spend a bit of time on that. And then if you can kind of grab them for 5 or 10 minutes, you can have them up and running with their classroom and logging in students, and I think that's really what set it apart. And in terms of what it looks like when you come in, it's like, it's the one-stop shop. And if you give it kind of half an hour, you can get up and running. And if you give it a couple of hours with someone who has a bit of experience, you can really get it going, and really get everyone on board.
I think what we found with G Suite, when I was setting it up, the first time I set it up, I was using the term Google Apps for Education. Oh, you're going to use Google Apps for Education for that, and people zoned out. Or teachers zoned. Now this is going back 7 years ago now, but they zoned out with I don't understand this Google Apps for Education. But when you removed the terminology and you sign in here with your email address, your school email address, and that sign in opens up a window that gives a sandbox, if you like, that gives you access to your emails and your drive. The Classroom didn't feature at the time. All of a sudden they understood it, and it's that intuitive understanding of what's going on is, in my opinion, why it's doing really well at the moment. Now there are others. I mean, 365, we featured 365 2 weeks ago with Helen, and it's fine if that's the way you're going. But for me, it's the intuitive, to be able to sit down and just automatically know without training. Now, to get to the next level, a bit of training helps, but not to need the training is a huge deal. How are the email addresses handed out in your school? So one of the big fears, and one of the things I get asked all the time, is, when do I hand out email addresses? How do I create email addresses? Who creates the email addresses for me? Are students allowed to have email addresses? Could you, without putting you on the spot, sort of cover some of those questions?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's the landscape has changed a huge amount in the last 2 years with the GDPR regulations, So, but if you go back to what existed before G Suite, a lot of schools could have been using, if they were techie schools, they might have had an in-school server and the headaches of administering that. The alternative then is schools would have used web hosts, which where they can create email accounts, but they tend to be quite clunky. That was this scenario in a lot of schools that I would have dealt with. There's no automatic way of creating the accounts. You're going in and you're kind of you're clicking buttons to create the accounts. I mean, the beauty of G Suite is in the administration of users particularly, and I have a video up on YouTube on how to on this, is that all you need is a CSV file. So a CSV is a comma separated values file, and you can generate these with just like Excel or any spreadsheet software. And literally you just have a list of names. There's a little kind of magic in the formulas. So a couple of formulas will generate the format for the names, and then you can save that list and upload it into the G Suite interface, and it will automatically create those accounts for you. So there's different approaches. And
can I just mention, just on a point, in the CSV file and the fact that you've uploaded stuff to YouTube, I think it's worthwhile checking out Conor's YouTube presence, and indeed on Twitter as well, because you have loads of videos up, and you put up a CSV instructional video at the same time I put up a CSV instructional video. You got hundreds of views, and I got 9. So your videos are getting traction. So don't underplay them at all.
Yeah, yeah. It depends. Like some of them are very timely. Like you said, the traction a lot can be down to what people are trying to do at the time. And I did put a lot of content on Twitter because it seemed to be a real central point when things kicked off on how to get going. And we were in a lucky position that we had been using the technology for many years, but some schools needed to do a really quick ramp up in terms of provisioning accounts, etc. I mean, it was so good for us to have the students all provisioned with accounts and ready to go online. So with the CSV in particular, there's a couple of kind of considerations. One would be around how do you name the students, because if you do, you could do numbers for anonymity a bit. You can do we do first name, surname, but we put the start year. So we do kind of a format would be, for me, starting next year, be 20 C power. At cco.ie for us in Coláiste Ciarán. Like another consideration in terms of email that schools mightn't think about, and when I've helped a number of schools get set up, is the domain name in particular. So schools will have usually got their own homepage, and schools, particularly if they've got long names as Gaeilge, there's a lot of opportunity for misspelling email addresses. So I would encourage them to kind of come up with an abbreviation. Because then people could try fadas or misspell a lot of, especially Irish schools. So something short, like we're cco.ie, Coláiste Ciarán online, if you will, and a lot of the other schools I would advise have gone the same route. Some schools could be worried as well when they're setting up G Suite that when they go tinkering with the settings on their normal school website, that they could mess something up and lose access to their homepage for a while. Some schools with G Suite also gives you the ability to set up multiple domains within your G Suite account. So you could have a staff and a student email address and have them slightly different, and it will allow you slightly more control over what you can do there. But in terms of the ins and outs of giving students access to mail, obviously, any IT coordinators and management will have to look at the GDPR regulations and come up with a plan around that. We found it actually impacted us. We tended to be not too vociferous around students when they leave, because a lot of students, when they did the CEO applications, etc., would have used their school email accounts. And so we would leave them active for, the bones of a year after they leave the school. But under GDPR, we can no longer do that. So for anyone managing G Suite now, there's a bit of pressure there just to make sure that when someone leaves the organization, that they no longer have access to their account, because that's part of the regulations. I mean, the good thing about G Suite is it does allow you to take out your email and your documents as well. But in terms of how and when we provision the accounts, then we would give for straight up in first year. Okay. Straight up in first year, we would have a couple of orientation days at the start before the rest of the school start back, and we use that opportunity to get the students in and get them logged in, because once we have them logged in and using it. And the big thing with students using email is actually that the school uses it effectively. If you give a student an account and they're not really using it that often, they will forget the password and just won't think of logging in. But one thing that's really we found very effective since the lockdown started is we created a Google Classroom for each year group, and that allows us then to post notices and forms and announcements and videos, anything, to the year groups. And that, that's been really, really helpful, because I think the students kind of find the email avalanche a bit tricky to manage, whereas, with Classroom, it's a bit more straightforward in terms of what's laid out in front of them. And
because that was going to be my next question. So you've set up all your first years now, and in particular, I suppose, this coming year. So you've set up all your first years. There you go. There's email addresses. Mm-hmm. I'm involved with a few schools, and I've asked from both 365 point of view and from G Suite point of view. But I've said for teachers who are unsure, include me as a student on your whatever you're using, and I'll get a notification and I'll be able to see if I see any mistakes coming up. Then I'll be on the phone to you, or if you don't hear from me, it's good. Now, I found my inbox got very loud. So it's interesting that you're saying that for school student information, instead of it being an email, they use their email to access a central location rather than the inbox being the central location.
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid the noise, I think? Or was that your thinking, avoiding the noise of the inbox?
Well, there was a number of advantages really to having the classroom set up, is because, you know, you have already made, also like you have already made a list of all the students in the year, because what you'll find with big schools particularly, you have students come and go, and it can get messy, particularly at transition year. Some students go straight into 5th year, and managing kind of year group lists can be quite tricky. Whereas with Classroom, you can give out the code and you can see at a glance who's enrolled in the class. And also, students will also, you know, if you tell a student, oh, I sent you an email, they'll go, oh, you know, I'm going to. Whereas if you have things organized in topics and Classroom, it's much easier. I mean, the email is still vitally important for direct communications, particularly. But just since we've started using it this year, we have found that definitely Classroom makes a lot more sense in terms of general communications, because, you know, Classroom also has the option of asking questions, or, you know, you can put up your forms and surveys that way as well. And yeah, we just find it's easier to organize, particularly in relation to things like a Google form you might have sent out a couple of weeks ago. You'd normally have to go in and resend that email directly to a student. Also, when you have all the students in a classroom, you have the option of sending them a group email automatically as well. So it just saves the hassle of managing a class set. And also then there are certain tasks during the year, particularly with JCT, around collecting maybe evidence of work or particular things for a whole year group. And it's nice to be able to have that, you know, with the Classroom, you can view assignments and who's turned in and who's done what. The only downside of it that we had to work around, I mean, the thing with Google is if there's features missing or features that don't work exactly the way you want, there are kind of hacks that you can get to. So with a year group Classroom, you can only have a maximum of 20 teachers. So you know, an option around that would be to create, say, all the PE teachers wanted to post kind of during the lockdown, they wanted to post PE activities. So you mightn't have enough space in 20 teachers so you create a general PE account and allow them to post from that. Or you could nominate one teacher in the group, or you can add and remove teachers, but it was just a thing there. You know, there are always workarounds for these things. So yeah, we found that quite effective. We would have the students then kind of, like I said, in the first week log in, because once they're into Gmail, they get access to everything else. And there's two other considerations. Like one, next year we're rolling out Chromebooks for all our first years. So we've bought a set of Chromebooks, and when they come in the door, they'll be given the Chromebook. And the idea is we want to grow with that. You know, rather than the chicken before the egg, rather than have a kind of a technology program where we tell them, you know, buy these and everything will be great. We want to prove the concept by putting the Chromebooks in their hands, by using it effectively. And then say in year 2, you know, you've had the experience, you know, now's the time to invest. The second thing is like,
can we talk a bit more about that? That's an interesting approach. So is this, you're testing out Chromebooks, but you're not saying we're testing out Chromebooks. Your first years are coming in and you're just giving them devices.
Well, we're long past the testing stage in terms of, we have a couple of sets of Chromebooks that we have.
Okay, sorry.
But like that, I mean, sets are great, and they're a great alternative to kind of, you know, quite often with labs, there's pressure on spaces, and, you know, it's nice to be able to have the set. But sometimes, you know, there are issues around booking, and I find like for managing labs and laptops, it's the usual. Everyone wants it period 2 on a Monday, and then period 1 on a Tuesday. No one needs it. So the sets are very handy there to fill a gap. But really, for consistency, we want, you know, we want everyone to have access to the technology, and particularly in first year. Now, there are arguments around they need it even more in third year around CBAs, so we do have enough technology to cover that eventuality as well. But the Chromebooks are so useful in terms of deployment as well, and management, and particularly with the new Chromebooks, which I'll discuss a bit later when we talk about buying options there, and that they're a very kind of effective machine to use in this kind of a scenario. And then by the end of first year, we guaranteed that the students not only are familiar with the software, but they've had the opportunity to use it extensively through the hardware. And the big thing about like technology, I mean, we've been a technology focused school for a long time, is availability. If you have you need access to one-to-one, and now there's an argument as well. 2-to-1 is a very effective way to teach for a lot of activities, but sometimes if there's particular assignments that are required, you need to know that each student in front of you is going to have the tech, or it kind of falls off. Say like if there are 5 students who don't, you have to provide for those and work it out. So this kind of eliminates that. So a teacher planning a class will know, like, all the students in front of me, they're going to have the technology and they're going to be able to do this. And the whole time, it goes without saying, like, it's technology enhanced learning. It's not using it for the sake of it. Obviously, some tasks and some activities technology will support, and others not. But I mean, that's what we want. We want it not to be a kind of like all tools, like you don't think too much about picking up your pen when you need your pen, or picking up a ruler or a set square when you need that. So this should be another aspect. This should be another kind of thing that.
But that, to be fair, I think you're on the right track there. I think you're definitely pointing in the right direction. But there's a bigger picture, and there's a bigger fear rather than a bigger picture. Is the infrastructure one is not there to support. So where I'm coming from is, I get asked, we've gotten the grant, the magic grant, it's landed, let's go buy some stuff. And you kind of have to go, stop now. Do you have a plan? Who tests that for you? Is that a teacher-led thing, or is it an outsider in?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, say myself and the principal of the school would have kind of had experience in industry in
Okay.
IT. So we're a different kind of case to a lot of schools. But like, I mean, we would have advised schools in the past, and it's absolutely key, particularly with Chromebooks, because you can do certain things offline with Chromebooks, but they're not a very fun device when you don't have any connectivity. It's changing a bit with Linux apps and that, but really, it's a you do need the infrastructure in place, and it's a hearts and minds with management as well. A lot of kind of forward-thinking principals will have no problem with the investment, but sometimes if the experience isn't there, they might balk at paying maybe 20,000 for a Wi-Fi installation. For a larger campus, like you are looking at 25,000 like for decent Wi-Fi. It's changed a lot since the PDST and the Department of Communications brought in the 100 meg. That was revolutionary. When I started in the school first, we were on a 3 meg connection.
Oh wow.
When the 100 meg came in, it was like a breath of fresh air. Then a lot of schools were finding actually that they were buying kind of either kind of consumer or small office, home office gear from local retailers, or that, and that was working fine when you had feck all bandwidth. But when you had 100 meg then, and you had loads of devices trying to pull off it, it was just falling over. Like, so we would have invested in a decent Wi-Fi, like we got Ruckus gear. You just have to get gear that's designed fit for purpose industry, which is concurrent users. Like, the problem with a lot of the home office and home gear is that it's designed for a family or a household of 10, 20 devices max, whereas you need a managed Wi-Fi infrastructure that's going to support kind of upwards of 40, 50 simultaneous connections on one node. So I mean, we're in the accommodation we're in is funny because we're in a lot of prefabs. A lot of the school is prefabs, so we were mad running cables, just kind of network cables across the roofs and dropping access points wherever you want. Like, Wi-Fi is a bit of it's a bit like it's a bit of a dark art in some ways. We're moving into a new build now, so like the Wi-Fi kit out will be a big focus for us. Like, but we found in the other infrastructure, some of the newer prefabs had kind of metallic shielding or something in the walls that didn't allow the signal to penetrate. So you might have to drop specific kind of access points in there. The other thing is kind of, I suppose, and what you said is like, knowing the right devices. I mean, like every school has to decide first what they want to achieve and what they want to do. And for some schools, the iPad might be the best choice. For some schools, a Surface tablet, if you're, or a Surface laptop, if you're 365. So you got to kind of start with what you're trying to achieve first. Some schools do a mix, like we would have a couple of sets of iPads for doing media work. And then we have the Chromebooks as our general purpose, but we'd have a couple of we have a set of then high-end laptops for doing DCG or kind of computer science if there's some 3D gaming or some work around that that needs to be done. But so the iPad works great for schools that have gone down that road. We just for our needs and what we have experience with teachers and staff, it's the Chromebook we find is the most effective device in that scenario. And the other thing then is just, I suppose, from a security and safety point of view, is managing the network. The PDST do provide filtering, so that's useful. But then on your Wi-Fi network, you might have to think about, how you're going to manage that securely. I mean, I don't know, a lot of people think that Wi-Fi passwords are pretty secure, but they're actually very easy to crack,
Stop it. Just stop now, because we can open worms all over the place.
Yeah. So like at industry level, they would tend to do a thing where you filter the actual kind of the device. So MAC filtering, it's called, where any device that's got a network card, the network card will have a unique kind of number, and you can decide only to let the ones you want on the network. Now, there's ways around that too. Like, I mean, we've had students in the past who've kind of done a few kind of hacks, but like you need a bit of counter hacking to trace them out sometimes. But I mean, you can only do what's realistic. But there's just some thought there, particularly in terms of bandwidth, because if you have a completely open Wi-Fi network, which I mean, if you have the ability to, you can, but you'll have students connecting phones. Those phones might have apps that might have ways around the kind of filtering that you have in the school. So that's a consideration. I mean, like if you have a school like us where you have upwards of 1,000 students, you can be sure that, our students are not allowed to use phones in the school, but like if they're on in the bag and they're connected, they can be pulling down updates and all the rest. So, you can have between desktops, laptops, a student could have a tablet and a phone. You could have 800 students in the school, but you could have 2,000-3,000 connected devices.
Yeah.
That's a consideration as well,
We've gone off topic, and this is definitely something that I wouldn't mind revisiting with regards to the hardware and the Wi-Fi for schools, especially coming into the new year. And of course, with blended learning, this magic blended learning that's been happening forever anyway, it's just now it's really being deployed. I think it's definitely it's a conversation for another day. But back to G Suite. So we mentioned you come in, you sign in, classroom. Calendar is something that's getting traction online at the minute on the CESI list. What's your experience with Google Calendar?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something we would have used a huge amount, but I think you find in organizations, other than even outside of schools like that, the kind of Outlook, Active Directory Outlook has been a huge focused calendar there, all your kind of, all the management features. And I think in a lot of schools, even if they went G Suite on the office and admin side, Outlook was probably still being used a lot for calendaring. But schools are discovering that Google Calendar has a lot of those features also. What I did some of the G Suite exams there last year, and so with G Suite you can do these level 1, level 2 exams, and you can do the trainer exam as well. And I found actually in preparing for that, there was stuff calendar could do that I wasn't even aware of. So that was something. So calendar isn't something we've massively used, but certainly something we're going to look at using a lot more. And you know, especially with Meet integration in Google Calendar, it's very powerful, and the ability to manage your meetings, you know, attach documents and share drives to the calendar. And look at calendar. We did a cursory look at it last year, but we didn't implement it. But you can use calendar to manage assets and equipment as well in terms of labs and gear. And something we did start last year is encouraging the students to use calendar a bit, because obviously if you're using Classroom and you put due dates on assignments, etc., calendar is very useful there for students to get an overview and agenda view of what's coming up and when assignments are due. So yeah, I know it's one thing that I think we're not. If I was to say one Google product that we haven't been using to the full potential, would be calendar, and it's something we're going to look to develop next year.
So that brings us nicely on to you mentioned the equipment. You've signed in. You're now on. You've signed up to Google Classroom. Your students have signed up to Google Classroom. They're getting notified when you have assignments sent to them. What's the student-teacher communication like? So at the moment we've discussed teacher-student and admin to teachers, so notice boards, etc. What's the reverse of that? So what's the student-teacher communication like?
Yeah, well, over the last number of years, the email has been the primary one. So a student will email, "Sir, I missed the class. What's the homework, etc." And actually, what has been great for is, you know, you'd often get requests from parents that their son or daughter could be they could be ill in hospital, and they're looking for teachers to coordinate sending work, you know, which is the job of work on for everyone involved. Whereas if you're using Classroom or something, it eliminates all that. So I mean, email would have been the default, but since we've been pushing, I mean, the thing with Classroom is, you know, it was growing in our school particularly, but not everyone was there, you know. So we had a large usage, but you know, since the lockdown happened, then, you know, all the teachers were on board, and now students have become accustomed to using that as a primary point of contact. So, like, I would encourage students, if they have a query about assignments, and I'm sure most teachers would be the same, if it's not kind of a sensitive or personal or nature, that they post it as a comment on the stream under the assignment, because as we all know, if one student is could be having trouble with something, then lots of them could be doing the same, but they won't tell you. So you know, we'd highly encourage, you know, if you have a query, if something doesn't make sense in the assignment or something's particularly difficult, to post it publicly. And you know, the great thing about this is actually, it's naturally how students communicate anyways, using comments and tagging and all this, you know, because we would have, I mean, all teachers will notice now, if they're teaching IT, that the ability to compose email or even understand what email is, it has gone on a massive downward curve.
Yeah.
So over the last number of years, students would have come in, they'd be familiar with email, they would have maybe Aircom or Hotmail or Yahoo or something accounts anyway, if not Gmail. But now they're coming in and they you know, they don't use email maybe at home, depending on what their parents are up to. They never see them using email because you know, there's kind of an age thing now. Younger people, it's kind of Snapchat,
TikTok,
TikTok, Snapchat. If you're kind of in your 20s, I guess it's Instagram, and if you're over the hill, then it's Facebook, kind of a thing. So you know, and the kind of the idea of commenting on the stream or on the particular piece of work is very useful as well. So I think certainly since the lockdown anyway, most of the communications with the students would be handled not via email, but through comments and feedback through the Classroom system, you know.
Yeah, I was watching a TED talk by a person a while ago. I can't remember exactly, but one of the things that they were talking about was they realized collaboration had become a success, or collaboration had become a success to them when the students started answering their own questions. So when Conor put up a question, how I'm struggling with this, I don't rightly know how to get to this point, another student jumped in. Now that doesn't have this is an ideal world that happens in, but every now and then that will happen. So when you're encouraging the student communication in a controlled environment, so in a comment section, that's a very good thing.
Yeah, and like all the studies will show, it's mutually beneficial. It's very beneficial for the student who's getting another take or another explanation of it from their peer. But in order for that peer to explain it, they have to do some deep thinking about it and put it down in a way that makes sense to someone else. So, they're doubly learning, and if you can encourage that kind of thing, it's hugely beneficial. And the well trotted out phrase is, be the sage on, be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage.
Yeah.
So that's it. And actually, just on collaboration, that's really where G Suite is the star. I find I use a lot of different platforms, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. But there's something about Google that just the collaboration is it works very effectively in real time and very reliably in real time. And I suppose that's because it was designed from the ground up that way, whereas some other products that have way better features for different things and offline activities where they've added on collaborative features, it just doesn't seem to be kind of as seamless, so that's the real strength of it, and yeah, sorry.
What tips or tricks do you have? Because we'll wrap it up now, and we'll talk about a buying guide for those interested in Chromebooks. And what I'll do is I'll put the whole lot up as one episode, but I'll actually chop off the buying guide and put that separately onto the CESI website, as opposed to us doing it twice. So, in 3 minutes, pro tips for using G Suite.
Pro tips. I suppose, like whenever I'm trying to do things in G Suite, if I haven't done them before, there's a saying, and it's true, it's that, people who are good at IT are just really good at Googling stuff.
So true.
I mean, quite often I would see queries because, on Twitter I put it out there, I have a bit of experience, so if you have any questions, and I get some things that I'm not that familiar with. But I'm just really good at finding the answer and sticking it up. So I don't always know, but there's such a good community there that someone will know. And, the tip is then as well is just, plug into these support networks, particularly CESI, and rather than the kind of individual tricks. I mean, just overusing G Suite over time, you'll find kind of hacks and kind of workarounds for things. But any kind of particularly pro tips? One pro tip actually would just be, if you're an admin, to get the app for your phone. There's a G Suite admin app on the phone that allows you to reset passwords, and I find it invaluable going around the school or in a class environment that a student will come up to you, I forgot my password, and rather than having to go and log into a machine, then you're kind of logging in that way. Another tip on the admin side particularly is two-factor authentication is very important on any admin accounts, and also maybe think of having a separate general use account. Say if I was administering a G Suite in a school, rather than having my everyday account be a super admin on the G Suite, maybe think about a separate Conor Power admin account.
Yeah.
That it's two-factor authentication and you only log in for that kind of stuff, because the risk is you leave the machine logged in somewhere, and someone can access that, and if they can get into the G Suite admin panel,
all of a sudden they change your name to Mr. Underpants Head, like.
Yeah, well, or kind of, God knows. The only other good thing about a couple of things about G Suite that people might be that aware of, like people say, "Oh, Google," I've heard principals or teachers saying, "Sure, what if something goes wrong? What can you do?" But you actually, Google support, their phone support, has been excellent. We've had occasion to ring them a couple of times for really kind of odd issues that we've had, and they've been hugely helpful. And you actually get access to that if you're setting up a G Suite account from when you apply for the upgrade. So the process for setting up G Suite, so a beginner's guide might be useful. You go into G Suite, you fill out the form, I'm an educational institution, etc., etc. You sign up for the basic G Suite package, and then you apply for an education upgrade. And from when you apply for that upgrade, they will give you a kind of a user contact number. So if you're having issues around not being active after a certain period of time, you can actually ring them for support, which is very, very useful. So the other thing then is actually in the admin console as well. There's really good auditing, so you can see, you can see your usage, which is useful. So you can see how often the users and what they're doing, what applications, how many documents are being created, all that. And you can also see what changes had been made in terms of admin settings, etc. And you can roll back things quite effectively, both as a user. So like a powerful feature of G Suite and Google Docs that most teachers will be aware of is that you can go in and see the revision history. So you can see who's done what changes. So if you're doing a shared document with the class and someone has taken the mic, you can go and revert it. But, in the admin console, there's also a lot of that functionality as well. If I delete a student account, which actually happened to me this year, I deleted a student account thinking they were gone from the school because there was some issue around their name in the VSware MIS system and G Suite. And a few days later, I got an email saying the student can't access their account, but you have 20 days to recover. So, you can roll back a lot of things, which really kind of save your life as well. And actually, speaking of rolling back, one feature in G Suite that you should enable is the undo send. So in your email settings, there's an undo send button, and it's really helped me out over time. Now it only gives you a couple of minutes. It gives you like a minute or two to unsend something, but quite often, you'd send something and you'd mistype it or you'd forget.
Yeah.
Google actually does remind you, I think, if you say like see the attached file and you don't attach anything.
Which is also a nice feature. But like when you email somebody something that was meant for somebody else, that's when undo send is vital. I've been that soldier.
And a lot of I remember the early days of G Suite, what used to happen a lot is whenever you're creating a group, there was a little tick box, and I think it was could have been checked by default, that said include everyone in the domain. So I know a lot of schools that set up a staff group and forgot to untake that, and then they were sending out like things about staff parties and stuff, and the students are coming back saying, "We'll see you there, sir." And the other thing, and we discussed this kind of prior to setting off the recording here, is that you can't have a manual of how to use G Suite, because if you're familiar with a lot of Google products, they will change all the time. So Google, so it's just a matter of kind of finding your way around. And quite often, like, there's funny ways Google will shift things from one menu to another. And in those occasions, I might have had to go onto the Google forum. So Google have their own support forums for G Suite, which are very good. And have a look around and see, because they will move things to a different menu position, which may be more intuitive. But if you've been finding it in the old in the old place for quite some time, that's
and I think you said it. I've been that soldier. I've gone in training for teachers just like you, and I've gone in and I've sat down and I said, right, now we're going to do a thing on the thing, and you click over here and you go, where's the button gone? why is it moved? But yeah, I think you said it really well offline, and it's a learning curve. You just open up and you say, look, this is what they do. They're constantly updating and they're constantly changing. And if they did get rid of the button, you can be sure it's not gone too far.
Yeah. There are, like, today we're using Google Buzz in education. Oh, no, we're not. It's gone. Google Wave, it's gone. Google Reader actually was fantastic, and that's gone. Google, they're kind of an agile company, so they'll make these decisions, and
that is a bit scary, but it's not the end of the world when this stuff. It doesn't go overnight. It does, or there is something in its place. The problem is you're used to what works. We tend to get used to an awful lot of stuff. A buying guide, Connor, a buying guide for devices, for Chromebooks. Where does one start? Because I have an old MacBook Air. Don't tell anybody I did this. That I just broke, and I pushed Chrome OS on it, and now it's a Chromebook. Now, again, Apple hardware, fantastic. Chrome OS, fantastic. Happy days. But if I was to go to the shop and buy a Chromebook, I wouldn't know where to start because there are so many. So you were telling me as a kind of a side chat that you're putting together a buying guide.
The thing with Chromebooks is a lot of the specs will look very similar. So probably the first choice, or the first thing you want to do is look at the updates. So when you buy a Chromebook, Google will guarantee updates to a certain year, you know. So just one thing might be if a supplier had kind of older stock or older inventory, just be aware that you want to check kind of the support date that Google. So I mean, we bought these are kind of latest mod we've got. They're Acer, and they're guaranteed updates till 2026. So if you were to give them to a first year now and they had them up to school, you're guaranteed the security updates. Now the device will still work after that, but you won't be guaranteed the latest updates, which would have kind of an impact in terms of GDPR. Like a good thing about these as well in terms of GDPR's Chromebooks is the user profiles are encrypted by default. So when someone logs in, you can't access the files unless you're logged in as that user, which is quite useful. Obviously, there's some obvious considerations will be around the screen size. So if it's one-to-one devices, the 11-inch one like this is nice and portable. But I know a lot of primary schools that are doing 1-2, or they've gone with 14-inch. So that's a consideration just in terms of screen size. But like any laptop, that's a common thing. So you decide that. The other thing then is that what you'll find is, one thing that we were looking for when we were speccing out the newer ones is that the newer ones are all switching to USB-C charging.
Okay.
So rather than having a proprietary charger, the old kind of barrel connector, one thing that's very useful, if you can get one that's USB-C charging, that's the new standard that's out. That's going to be kind of one cable to replace them all. And the idea is then if you have banks of chargers that you can interchange them, so USB-C will be the standard for nearly every mobile phone now, except for Apple, who have their own proprietary one, which they're fighting with the EU about at the moment. But USB-C is everywhere. And what you'll find as well is some of them no longer have HDMI ports or VGA ports. So if you're looking to hook up to projectors, that's done now through the USB-C as well.
Okay.
So the USB-C, and actually,
and is it a dongle you get, or
you can get a dongle USB-C to HDMI, or if you get a lot of the newer monitors now are coming with USB-C ports, and what they'll actually do is the modern monitors. Now, this isn't really a consideration for schools in terms of buying now, but the monitors will actually charge and display at the same time.
Okay.
So if you run the USB-C cable from here into an external monitor, you'll get your screen output on the monitor and it will charge to the laptop simultaneously if the monitor supports it. So that's, if you're just wondering why there's no HDMI. Now, if you do need to kind of be hooking them up to projectors for teachers or stuff, you might look for one with a HDMI. I don't know if you'll find one of the VGA, maybe some around, maybe not, I don't know. In terms of other ports, then they'll tend to have the standard USB connection there as well. Then some of them will have SD card slots and some of them may not. This one has the kind of the micro SD, same as your phone, so that's something to think about. They'll tend to have the combo jacks as well, so that's the microphone and headphone jack in one. So some laptops and desktops might have those as separate, but this is the one, so it uses the kind of the phone style connector, which is a TRRS tip ring sleeve, which will allow you to use a kind of a mic and a headset in there as well. And this one actually literally only has those ports. So it just has USB-C, USB, the standard, the connection, and it has the audio on that side. And then this little thing here, which you'll see on all the laptops, is a Kensington lock thing, which is standard. But in terms of spec, then what you'll find is a lot of similarities, in terms of the screen, you'll just have to read reviews, because unless you can go in and physically have a look, it's something that's hard to do. I was lucky enough to get over to Bet in the UK this year, and in the Google stand there, they'll have every Chromebook going and you can have a nice kind of look and see what's what. So the screen quality is something you might have to read a couple of reviews on. Some of the newer Chromebooks as well, they're coming with anti-pick keys, so that could be a factor, We've had an issue with some of the general use Chromebooks is that students will kind of pick the keys off. Some of the Chromebooks will come with recessed keys. Some of them have kind of spill-proof keyboards as well. And some of them has these kind of micro biotic coatings that are supposed to kind of reduce the risk of transmitting things, which could be important as well. But in terms of spec is really what I want to focus on. And what you'll find with Chromebooks, they'll tend to start with 2 gigs of RAM. Obviously 4 gigs would be better. So 4 gigs of memory. I'd recommend going with 4 gigs if you can. In terms of storage then, the lower end Chromebooks will come with 16 gigs of storage, which are probably okay for basic use. But here's the thing. What's really exciting me at the moment is that the Chromebooks are enabling the installation of Linux apps. So this brings apps that we would have used in school that haven't been able to use on a Chromebook before, like MuseScore for music, Audacity, for programming, things like Python, the full Python IDE, idle and stuff like that. So, in terms of Linux apps, then if you're looking at installing those, you'd really want to be going with 32 gigabytes of storage. So your RAM, which is your working area, you start at 2, which is your base point. If you can go to 4, highly recommend it. Your storage starts at 16. If you're not planning to use Linux apps and that, you might get, that might be adequate. But if you're looking at expanding it in the future and future proofing, 32 is better as well. And then the other thing to consider is the processor. So there's a lot of publicity over the last 2 weeks about Apple switching to making their own processors. And this is a bit technical, but if you bear with me, it'll make sense. So the most popular processors in the world in terms of laptops and desktops are Intel. So Intel make these processors, and most of the Chromebooks, or a lot of the Chromebooks you'll find, will have Intel processors. The very high-end Chromebooks might have something like a Core i3 or a high-end or a Core i5, but most of the Chromebooks down at the kind of 250, 300 euro level, they will have Celeron processors. Some of the really cheap ones could have Intel Atom processors, but I don't know if there's many of those around anymore. So you're looking at a Celeron. And the Celeron, then there's different model numbers, so they go from kind of an N3350, an N4000 is a good one, and they go slightly more powerful again than that. So the thing with processors then is that if you are planning to run Linux apps, or for kind of other reasons, that the Intel processors are really the ones to go for, because the Linux apps are optimized for those. However, what you'll find is when you're looking at Chromebooks, if it doesn't have an Intel Celeron, there is a second category of processor, and these are ARM-based processors. So the ARM processors are you'd be familiar with them from your phones. So all the kind of Snapdragons and all those phone processors are ARM-based. What's the company? Qualcomm. Qualcomm make the ARM chips on phones. So if you're looking at a Chromebook and you see that the processor, they all have different names. So the most common ones would be kind of MediaTek or Rockchip or something like that. That Chromebook will have an ARM processor. Now, it's very hard to directly compare processors. So what you generally have to do is look at kind of benchmarks or reviews. So if you look at benchmarks, it will show you. Now, the ARM processors, they're because there's different variants of them, the performance for, particularly if you're looking at Linux apps, isn't going to be as good. But one thing about the ARM processors, you find them a lot of kind of Chromebooks that have touch screens. And the other exciting thing about Chromebooks is you can now install Google Play apps and Linux or Android apps on them. So if you're looking at using it for more Android apps and kind of mobile stuff, and particularly if it's a touch screen, then the ARM processors are probably worth looking at. I've owned Chromebooks which have both, and I find the Intel ones have performed a little bit better for me, so that's a consideration.
And just keeping with the general theme of what works for you in the whole mess of processes. I've been doing this for too long to mention, and I still get my head baffled around processors. What works for you? Like, what do you find is good?
Well, kind of the modern ARM processors are they're quite good as well. But just in terms of software, like the Linux apps will be designed to run on Intel processors. Some Linux software is compiled specifically to run on ARM. Now, both processors will run everything, but they won't run stuff as well unless it's really been designed for that processor or a version of that software. This is a big thing that's going to hit the Apple computers now, and you may have heard some discussion around it, because Apple are switching to ARM-based processors that they're going to make themselves, but that means an app like Photoshop, Adobe don't have an ARM-based version of Photoshop. So software like that won't run natively on the ARM. So what they'll generally tend to do is they kind of put in a virtualization layer. Windows are doing this as well. So some of the Surface machines, some of the Surface computers you can buy now are ARM-based. But what they kind of do is when they're running software that there's no ARM native ARM version for it, they run a kind of virtualization layer. So they kind of run almost a virtual Windows machine to have that software run it. So there's a bit of a performance hit in that regard. So you'll find the same. It's just that in order for ARM processors to run software that's designed for Intel, there's a bit more overhead because they have to virtualize some elements of it. But what that equates to in Chromebooks is that if you're planning to run a kind of touchscreen Chromebook and you want to be using lots of the Android apps, that the ARM processors can perform a little bit better because the Android apps have been designed to run really well on ARM. Whereas if you're running a Chromebook to run the Linux apps, they're going to perform better on the Intel Chromebooks. Now, in general use, it might make a huge difference, but in terms of kind of if you're kind of forward planning, that could be a consideration. I know it's a little bit technical, but my best advice in terms of when you're buying is to look at benchmarks, because benchmarks are basically software that can be run on processors that will compare their speed at different things. And what you find with processors, Intel are the most popular, but in terms of desktops and laptops, there's also AMD, hugely popular as well. And when you're comparing processors, it's a bit like cars, you know. I mean, you can look at certain specs about a car like the CC and but you know, unless you actually kind of do a race in them, you don't see. So with benchmarks, what they do is they'll run different tests on them. And you might find some processors are much better at kind of office tasks, or some processors are really good at rendering video, but they may be good at other things. And particularly now, without getting too technical, processors have multiple cores. So some tasks, if you have one really powerful core that can run a task really fast, it's very useful. Some tasks can be divvied out among the smaller cores and they can run more efficiently that way. So it's really, really hard to directly compare processors based on any kind of, like, the processors will have a speed, they'll have what's called a clock speed, and they'll have cache, they'll have different levels of memory in them. But to get the overall picture of the processor, the only really kind of the way most people will do it is they'll run these test software on it and see. So, you know, when you Google them, you'll see them anyway, or kind of ask for advice. If you can, like with all schools, the best advice, and I've seen schools in the past that have bought sets of this, that, or the other without getting their hands on one, like, you know, sometimes it's worked out, sometimes it hasn't. If you can get your hands on, you know, on some suppliers will send you a demo or a test unit, or even, you know, if you look at the investment, if you're looking at 2 or 3 models, you know, if you can get your hand, and if you're buying 100 for a year group or something, if you can buy the 2 or 3 and play around with them and see, you know, you can maybe avoid making a big mistake, because, you know, if you buy 2 or 3 test units and you decide one of them seems to perform much better than the others, then you can confidently make a larger purchase. You know, try and get a demo unit, try and get your hands on one. Even go into the likes of Curry's, and they usually have all the Chromebooks on display there, and you can have a look. In terms of manufacturers, then, like, once you look at the processors, what's inside Chromebooks tends to be very, very similar, you know, because they're kind of all kind of like the component, you know, everything's built in to nearly the when you buy an Intel Celeron, a lot of the stuff is built in. So what the actual manufacturers are doing, or the value they add, or the differences in the units, tends to be more around the ports or the chassis than what's inside. Okay. And one thing we'd recommend, like, say we have all our sets have these kind of rubberized or ruggedized. Now, most of the manufacturers do some versions of these, but these have a rubber surrounding them, and you'll find students, you know, if they're hitting them off desks or walls, that's very useful as well. The pick-proof keyboards would be useful as well. If you're doing general class sets, sometimes it can be a bit tricky to keep track of what's going on. There's little other bits as well that are harder to kind of gauge, like webcams and touchpads, and you only really get a feel for those by either using them yourself or reading a lot of reviews, which I tend to do. The thing with Chromebook and particularly education models is it can be hard enough to find reviews sometimes because these kind of YouTube reviewers tend to do consumer gear more so. The education, they can be a bit niche, like, so that's it. So, the processor thing might have been a bit of a kind of rabbit hole, but in the rest of it, 4 gigs of RAM minimum, I would say. 16 gigs of storage, okay, but 32 better. The other reason the 32 is better actually is with the Linux stuff is that at the moment, at least, if you're installing Linux software, it's installed to that user profile. So, if you're installing a particular piece of software and it's 100 megs or 500 megs, if another user logs in, they have to install that on their own profile also. It's because of the fact that Chrome uses encrypted containers for each user profile. So that's why you need the extra storage if you're going down that route. But if you're starting off, it's not a consideration. But if you're kind of looking at the technical side of Linux apps later down the line, it might be something worth thinking about.
Excellent stuff. Conor Power, thank you very much for that, for all that information. Don't forget, you can get a hold of us on Twitter at Hassan Daba, on Twitter at CESI Tweets. And Conor, what's your own Twitter handle?
I'm at Con Power, so CONPOWER, and the CESI list, obviously, like we discussed with likewise with the students. If you've got something specific, if you throw it up where everyone can kind of contribute, you're going to have a better experience.
Excellent stuff. Conor Power, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again because I want to extend this for 1 or 2 more episodes.
Thanks, Hassan. Yeah.